Are you ready? Yeah, I'm ready. Pick a side and choose. Are you ready? Yeah, I'm ready. No, we can't lose. Are you ready? Grab your cleats, go and tie your shoes. Are you ready? It's one time. No, we can't lose. We hit the field. It ain't no we run the game. Talking honey yard dash. Headed to the Hall of Fame. Who else do you know? Going 17 and 0. When you mentioning the greatest, boy, just check out Super Bowls. We crash your jet. The Bills got a whole beast. Swim with a shark. With a sand to a goat. Like corn on the street. Call the play TD. We play been a man, but they won't get beat. Who else do you know? Going 17 and 0. When you mentioning the greatest, boy, just check out Super Bowls. Are you ready? Yeah, I'm ready. Pick a side and choose.
All right, see, that is the kind of intro that we need in this podcast right now. Last season, sure, it was good, but it was kind of long-winded. It was boring. We need some fucking hype. That intro just did it. I have no idea how long it's going to last. I don't think I went through the right channels to give the actual content providers the credit that they actually deserve. But here we go. If it lasts, we're good. I think this podcast is like 14 views an episode. I don't think YouTube's taking it down anytime soon. There's no monetization coming from this, so I think we're good. But enough of the boring stuff. Let's jump right into it. We've got week 1 underway in the 2023-2024 season, and these are the current standings. The Browns are leading the way in the AFC, and the Panthers are leading the way in the NFC. Who the fuck cares, right? We still have 13 games left of the regular season, but what week 1 is really good for is overreacting to certain stats, and I found some interesting ones. If we look at the players who were eligible for holdouts last year, we have 4 different guys whose teams decided not to give them the contract that they deserved. We have Patrick Mahomes, Saquon Barkley, Nick Chubb, and Justin Jefferson. Patrick Mahomes finished 5th overall in week 1. Saquon Barkley, 31st, but we'll bypass him. Nick Chubb finished 9th, and Justin Jefferson finished 5th. If we look at the teams that decided not to sign these players and to have them hold out for a portion of the season, we have 2 teams that lost in week 1. We have the 49ers and we have the Texans. The 49ers decided to not sign Justin Jefferson, and if you look at how many points Justin Jefferson got in week 1 compared to who they had in their flex position, the 49ers could have started 1-0 if they decided to sign Justin Jefferson. And then if you look in the AFC, the Texans, they decided not to sign Nick Chubb. They decided to let him hold out. If Nick Chubb was in the Texans' flex position, Nick Chubb would have allowed the Texans to start 1-0. Both the 49ers and the Texans, they're now 0-1. We can argue they made a bad decision by not allowing their players to have a higher contract and cheaping out and saying we're not signing you, but they have to sit on their bench. But now moving on, like I said in the intro, it's time for a brand new segment, and this segment is called Cherry Picking a Stat to Form a Negative. Because guess what? There's no bias in fantasy football, right? Okay, let's cherry pick some stats. If you look at who could have been start worthy in week 1 that gave you 0 points, we have T. Higgins, Drake London, and Dallas Goedert. Now let's start with T. Higgins. He gave you 0 receptions for 0 yards. If you look at his counterpart on his team, Chris Evans, he gave you 1 reception for -1 yards. Now T. Higgins, he's a wide receiver. Chris Evans, he's a running back. But if you put either of them in your flex position, Chris Evans, who got -1 yards in the receiving category, just that alone gave you 0.9 fantasy points because of the 1 reception. That means Chris Evans is better than T. Higgins. Now let's look at Drake London. Drake London gave you 0 receptions for 0 yards. His counterpart is Desmond Ridder. Desmond Ridder on the same team, sure, he gave you a lot of fantasy points, but just in the reception category, he had 1 reception for -6 yards. That still equates to 0.4 fantasy points. 0.4 fantasy points for Desmond Ridder against Drake London. You can argue right now Desmond Ridder is a better wide receiver than Drake London. Now let's go to Dallas Goedert. He gave you 0 fantasy points, 0 receptions for 0 yards. His counterpart, Terrell Owens, also could have given you 0 receptions for 0 yards. But if you compare both of them, Dallas Goedert, he gave you 0 sit-ups. Terrell Owens, he gave you a whole bunch of sit-ups during some media press conferences. If you were to pick between the two, Dallas Goedert, who gave you 0 points, Terrell Owens, who gives you 0 points, you go with a guy who gives you more sit-ups. Terrell Owens was a better fantasy play in week 1 than Dallas Goedert. And that right there is cherry-picking a stat to form a negative. Okay, and before we end today's episode, I want to quickly talk about some changes that are here for the 2023-2024 season for Out of the Box Fantasy. We have a major change when it comes to the practice squad. You don't just have to sign rookies to the practice squad, you can now sign veterans. You also can't keep a player on your practice squad consistently throughout the year because once the trade deadline happens, somebody else might be able to take those players from you. I won't bore you with all the details. You can find everything in the Google Docs. I'll highlight the page right here, but I encourage you to look at that yourself because it'll definitely affect your team. Another change is that every single team now has a 14th offensive contract that they have access to. This is because we're trying to transition from the old fans bonuses that used to exist to the new fans program that I'll talk about in a second. There was a few teams that had the bonuses of a 14th contract, and we thought it was unfair to take it away from them, but to not allow another team to have it. So we just gave everybody a 14th contract for this year, but plan ahead because next year, if you want that 14th contract, you have to pay for it in the franchise upgrades. And if you don't want to pay for it, I highly encourage you to not use it this year because you will have to pay for it next year. So you have access to it. It's free, but plan ahead still. Thank you to everyone who tuned into today's episode. Episode 1, Season 2, Thing with No Name, massive change. Hopefully everyone likes it. I would have loved to talk with the fans in this episode, but my phone just died. It's now 12:30 in the morning. I really want to make sure that this episode gets out before the Thursday night game that happens in week 2, so that way everyone can see everything that was posted. I'll talk about fans in another episode. If you have any information, if you want any information about the fans, I made a couple posts about it. You can check it out. But I will talk about it in another episode. But have a great day, everyone. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.
Pick a side and choose. Are you ready? Yeah, I'm ready. No, we can't lose. Are you ready? Grab your cleats, go and tie your shoes. Are you ready? It's one time. No, we can't lose. We hit the field. It ain't no we run the game. Talking honey, y'all next. Headed to the Hall of Fame. Who else do you know? Going 17-0. When you mentioning the greatest, boy, just check out Super Bowls. We crash your jet. The Bills got a whole beat. Swim with a shot with a sink to a goat. Like corn on the street, called a play TD. We play been a man, but they won't get beat. Who else do you know? Going 17-0. When you mentioning the greatest, boy, just check out Super Bowls.